Hello, I'm continuing my reviews on the Nightmare on Elm Street series with A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors. This, of course, is the third installment of the series, and I think it may have been intended to be the last installment, but I'm not really sure. Now, a lot of people consider this to be the best of the Nightmare on Elm Street sequels, and I'm actually not sure if I consider this to be the best, but I do like this a lot, and I can see why people consider this to be the best out of the Nightmare on Elm Street sequels. Wes Craven, who directed and wrote the first one, co-wrote the screenplay for this. The screenplay for this is written by Wes Craven, Bruce Wagner, Chuck Russell, who also directed the movie, and Frank Darabont also co-wrote the screenplay for this. For those of you who don't know who Frank Darabont is, he's the same guy who directed The Shawshank Redemption, The Green Mile, and The Mist. Chuck Russell, the guy who directed this movie, went on to direct the 1988 remake of The Blob. So yeah, you have Wes Craven, the man who directed the first one, coming back to do this one, and the movie also stars Patricia Arquette, and Lawrence Fishburne is actually in this movie as well. He plays like an orderly or a nurse at the hospital in the movie, you know. And Lawrence Fishburne is actually really good in this movie. So is Patricia Arquette. John Saxon, of course, reprises his role as the character of Lieutenant Thompson from the first one, and Heather Langenkamp reprises her role as Nancy Thompson in this movie as well. But basically, the movie is about a girl named Kristen Parker, played by Patricia Arquette, who is having these nightmares, of course, about Freddy Krueger. She, of course, at this point doesn't know who Freddy Krueger is yet, but she has these nightmares about him, and what happens is she has a nightmare where Freddy Krueger cuts her wrist, but he makes it look like in the real world that she cut her wrist. So she wakes up in the bathroom, and her mother walks into the bathroom and sees the razor in her hand, and it looks like she cut her own wrist. Her mother now thinks she's suicidal and ends up putting her in this psychiatric hospital called Western Hills. And in this hospital, there's this whole wing devoted to this particular group of patients who all refuse to go to sleep, and you know, it turns out they've all been having nightmares about Freddy Krueger, and of course the doctors at the hospital think that these are just a bunch of suicidal teenagers who need help, and obviously that's understandable because these doctors can't possibly know that these kids actually are being hunted by a supernatural force of evil. But what happens is, out of the doctors, the most likable character is this character named Neil, who's a psychologist at the hospital, and Neil is actually a very likable character. Like, you can tell Neil really does care about these kids, and he wants to help these kids. What happens is, they end up bringing a social worker into the hospital, and this social worker is actually Nancy Thompson, who was the main character in the first one. Nancy Thompson, of course, is much older now, and it turns out that after the events of the first one, she's been studying, like, nightmares and, like, what causes it, and, like, she's been studying nightmares and stuff, and she's become a psychologist, and she realizes that these kids, that Freddy Krueger's going after these kids, so she now is trying to, you know, so she wants to help these kids. What happens is, she meets Kristen, and Kristen, of course, later in the film has a nightmare about Freddy, and it turns out that Kristen has this power to actually bring other people into her dream. So she brings Nancy into her dream, so that's when Nancy realizes that Kristen has this power. Nancy and Kristen, of course, wake up, and so now that they realize, now that Nancy realizes that Kristen has this power, she figures that maybe she can use this power, like maybe if they can bring other people into the same dream, maybe they can all band together and fight Freddy Krueger. So basically Nancy and Neil start developing kind of a relationship with each other, and Nancy manages to convince Neil to hold a session where they actually hypnotize these patients, and Neil agrees, and they hypnotize him to go to sleep. And what happens is Nancy and Neil end up falling asleep as well, and they all end up in the same dream together. And in this movie they establish the idea of dream powers, which actually is a pretty interesting idea, because this is a series which deals with the concept of dreams overlapping reality. So, the idea here is that in your dreams you have a special power. So they all end up in the same dream together, and it turns out that each of these kids has these special powers in their dreams. They call them dream powers. So I thought that was really cool. This movie definitely has a lot of imagination to it as far as the concept of dreams is concerned. The idea of dream powers is a pretty inventive idea in my opinion. But what happens is, of course, Joey ends up getting taken hostage by Freddy Krueger. There's this kid, Joey, who gets taken hostage by Freddy Krueger in the dream, but they all wake up, but in real life it looks like he's in a coma, but in the dream world he's, being held hostage by Freddy. So now they have to figure out a way to to save Joey from Freddy Krueger. So, eventually, towards the end of the movie, Nancy and these kids fall asleep, and they all end up in the same dream, and these kids have to use their dream powers to save this kid Joey and stop Freddy Krueger once and for all. Now, what's happened is the character of Neil, he is seeing this nun at the hospital, and this nun tells him that after Freddy Krueger was murdered, now of course not too many people actually realize that Freddy Krueger was murdered, but this nun of course knows that he was, and that the people who murdered him hid his remains, So now this nun tells Neil, because this nun knows about Freddy Krueger, and she tells Neil that the only way to really stop Freddy Krueger is to find his remains and bury them in hollowed ground. So, before Nancy ends up going into the dream world, Nancy and Neil track down Nancy's father, who was part of the mob that killed Freddy Krueger when he was human. So, of course, what happens is Neil and Nancy's father, who of course is played by John Saxton in the movie, they have to go to where Freddy Krueger's body is hidden so they can bury it and lay Freddy's spirit to rest. But at the same time, Nancy and these kids go into the dream world to try to rescue this kid Joey. It's a really good addition to the series in my opinion. Definitely uses a lot of imagination as far as the concept of dreams is concerned. And one thing I like about this is they build a little more on the backstory of Freddy Krueger. Like, in this you find out a little more about who Freddy Krueger was when he was human. It turns out that you find out who his mother was in this movie. When Neil's talking to this nun, the nun tells him that there was this woman, this young girl named Amanda Krueger, who was also a nun at the hospital, and she was accidentally locked in this wing with all these patients, and the patients kept her hidden and actually raped her. and this rape impregnated her, and that child, of course, ended up being Freddy Krueger. So in this you actually find out who Freddy's mother was when he was human. So I thought that was really interesting. All in all, this is a great addition to the series. I can definitely see why people consider this to be the best of the Nightmare on Elm Street series. I'm not really sure if I do consider it to be the best, but... Well, it's not considered to be the best of the series, but it's considered to be the best sequel to the first one, and I'm not sure if I actually consider it to be the best, but I do consider it to be a great sequel and highly recommended if you haven't seen it. My next review will be on A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master.